Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Mark Plant. I'm a Senior Policy Fellow at the Center for Global Development, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. As the world confronts the need to invest more in basic infrastructure and to grow various economies, it's been clear that the financing needs are huge. The estimates are in the trillions of dollars. And a key component of that financing will come from domestic revenue mobilization, amounts that countries raise themselves to make the needed investment and to support the needed expenditures in their own budgets. But many countries have been stagnant in their domestic revenue mobilization. Studies have shown that lots of countries have been unable to increase the amount of domestic revenue mobilization, and this has posed a problem for them in the management of their budgets. They become increasingly reliant on grants and loans from other countries, which puts them in a difficult fiscal position. So a major effort of the international community is to increase domestic revenue mobilization. The chief tool for doing this is really learning from other countries how they did it. Not many countries have been successful in doing it so far, but there are those who have gained increasingly. But the lack of consistent data across countries has made this learning very difficult. Yesterday, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, launched a comprehensive database tracking revenues, both levels and consumption and composition, of 193 countries since the early 1990s. This database should prove an valuable resource to the IMF in its analysis of country positions, to country officials as they look at their own data, their own domestic revenue mobilization, and how they can improve their efforts, to researchers who are trying to find good solutions, and to civil society who put forward solutions and make sure that these solutions are equitable and just and help countries as a whole. So these data are needed. They've been long absent, and so we think this tool is incredibly important for the discussion ahead. We have representatives from all four of these areas to discuss this database. Let me introduce them to you. First, we have Nara Moncom, an associate professor of economics at the University of Pretoria. We have Frankie Buyamba, the regional manager of the African Tax Administration Forum. Mario Mansour, the division chief from the Fiscal Affairs Department at the IMF. Sanjeev Gupta, a senior policy fellow here at CGD, and we'll be joined shortly by Imdad Ullah Bosal, the finance secretary of Pakistan. So to get this webinar started, let me call on Mario to present the database work that the IMF has done.
So I'm Imdad Bosal, Secretary of Finance.
Welcome, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
Mario, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Mark. So what I'm going to do is, if I can share the presentation, or will the CGD do this? Okay, thank you. So what I'm going to do is to go through essentially how we compile the data, just say a few words about what kind of effort was involved in compiling the data. I will then just give you a few stylized facts of what the data contains. Nothing really analytical, just some very simple stylized facts, and then say a few words about the next steps. So the motivation, I think Mark has mentioned several of these factors, is really to have a global database that covers all countries. And the reason why it's important to cover all countries is because we know that domestic resource and domestic revenue mobilization depends on many factors, which sometimes are geographic. For example, landlocked countries or small island economies can have different constraints, be them, in the instruments they can use, in the policy instruments they can use, or in their fiscal institutions to raise revenues. So having a comprehensive database really gives us a chance to consider many, many more factors in the study of DRM than what we have done in the past. What is the database? Essentially 32 years roughly of composition of total revenues, tax and non-tax. So in the non-tax area, the main components are revenues from natural resources, grants, and earmark revenues like social security contributions, which tend to be big items, particularly in advanced economies. And then we have tax revenues, of course. And the way we compile the data is to have main components of tax revenues that together account for roughly 90% of total tax revenues on average globally. The common compilation method used is the Government Finance Statistics Manual of the IMF. For those who are not familiar with it, this is a classification, a common classification recognized globally for all government transactions, not only on the revenue side, but also on the spending side and on the capital side. So this common classification is updated once every decade or so. We used the most recent update to compile the data. Another feature of the data is there are no surveys or questionnaires to countries. This is entirely based on data submitted by countries as part of the surveillance function of the IMF, which is the annual review of countries' economies. And so these data, what is really important is that they are extensively discussed with IMF country teams. So the classifications are discussed, the detail is discussed, and the idea is to try to get them from the start as close as possible to the GFS classification. And this, as I will show, has improved over time tremendously, particularly for years 2000 forward. The work that it took us is a small team of about 18 months to do this work. We hope that future updates will be much easier to do. Now, this here, there's a lot of numbers, but you can focus perhaps just on the right-hand side panel, which is what we call the coverage. The number of countries, number of observations, and coverage is the percentage of measured observations in the total. And it's quite good. So for total revenues, for example, we have 84% of possible data points. For tax revenue, 81%. Now, obviously, for tax revenues and even subcomponents of tax revenues, lower than 100 simply means that some countries don't have these tax sources. And then in orange, the big components of non-tax revenues, social security contributions, grants, and levies on extractive industries, such as royalties, dividends from state-owned enterprises, and profit shares contract. So we're happy with the improvement of coverage over time, and we hope that this will continue in the future. Users and users, obviously, there is a wide range of stakeholders who would be interested in this. Some example of the uses are benchmarking levels and composition of government tax revenues. So one thing we do frequently at the IMF is to find good comparables for countries to look into more in depth. Comparisons are good, but they could be misleading. For example, if a country is looking at the wrong comparables given its economic and institutional structure. We can do policy impact analysis. We can obviously track domestic revenue mobilization. Again, Mark mentioned that it's a very, very hard business to mobilize domestic revenues. Although there are successes in the past 3 decades, there are also a lot more how should I say that, misses or declines in tax revenues. Users, a broad range. It could be academia. Obviously, at the IMF, this is one of our main tools that we use internally to assist countries in these areas, ministries of finance, think tanks, and obviously also donors actually funding governance projects or taxation and institution building projects. It gives them a platform where comparables are consistent over time and across countries. Now, what are some of the stylized facts? I think one thing that we learned from this exercise, which I wasn't really fully aware of, is really the importance of non-tax revenues on average around the globe. So on the left-hand side panel, we have total and tax revenues, and on the right-hand side, the share of tax revenues in total. And we are around 55% today, hovered between 55 and 60% over the past 3 decades or so. And that's important. I mean, that tells us a lot about the DRM, that on average, there is a significant component of total revenues that's coming from non-taxes. And obviously, it has implications. It has implications for things like credibility of policymakers and sustaining a non-tax resource for the long term. Now, I will say a few words in the next slide about what's driving mostly this graph here on the right-hand side. Here, I'm just giving the components and the importance of the components and their evolution over time. I want you to focus really on the top two to the left, tax and total revenues for the 3 income groups. So low-income countries, emerging economies, and advanced economies. Now, in advanced economies, what is really, really important to notice here is that there is stagnation in total and tax revenues over the past 3 decades. So not much really to say. And what is really important is that the difference between these two, meaning the difference between total and tax revenues, is essentially social contributions in advanced economies. And these are reflected in the middle bottom panel, where you have social contributions in green, that is about between 8 and 10% of GDP over the period. The second key point to mention is the increase in total revenues in emerging economies and low-income developing countries is to some extent driven by increase in tax revenues. So you'll see that both of these graphs are, sloping slightly upward over time. However, the difference between the two, unlike in advanced economies, is really natural resource revenues, particularly in emerging market economies. So that's the panel, the top panel to the right, where you see, for example, the red graph in emerging market economies. It's about 15% of GDP, went down to roughly between 5 and 10% in the most recent years, since about a decade or so. So natural resource revenues are still very, very important, but they're declining. Obviously, the implications in the long term is that these countries will have to seek for revenues from other sources, which is, I presume, more difficult, because if it involves taxation, the dynamics of taxing are obviously different than the dynamics of just getting revenues from natural resources. So the last thing I wanted to show you that we did with the database, which I think would be extremely useful for countries, is to update our estimates on tax potential, which we published last year in a staff discussion note, and actually launched a note at the CGD as well. So the estimates with the new data are not different from the old data we used. And the reason is simple. The reason is that the compiled new data really is rich in the composition of total and tax revenues, and not necessarily in total tax revenues. So the series total tax revenues is of very good quality. But here what we're doing with this exercise is we're making richer the composition of tax revenues and the coverage of this composition over all IMF countries. So the estimates are essentially about 8% of GDP of tax gap, if I may call it like this, in low-income developing countries, 5 points in emerging market economies, and 2.2 in advanced economies. So this is very consistent with the estimates we published last year. And to the right-hand side, we did also an exercise that we hadn't done last year, which is to show how this gap has evolved over the past 3 decades. And the lesson really from this graph is that the gap in, if you look at low-income developing countries to the right-hand side or emerging market economies, the gap has shrunken a bit. And that's obviously in part due to the fact that these groups of countries have, on average, mobilized more revenues than 2-3 decades ago. So what are the next steps? Just a few words on the next steps. So the database is up on the IMF website. We'd like you to use it to tell us what you think. There's an email that's world@imf.org. You can, send comments to the email, possible improvements or things that you don't like in it, or maybe errors that you find that we haven't, that we overlooked. We plan on doing annual updates starting about this time of the year next year, to which we will include the years 2023 and whatever is available for 24, plus review of the most recent 2 years, that's 22 and 21. We'd like to also consider doing a bit more work for the earlier years, 80 to about 95. The information that's available is just harder to work with because it is on a scanned IMF documents, not available in electronic format. And we hope that in time, perhaps next year, the database will be moved to a new IMF platform where users can do simple manipulation of the database without having to copy it and use other software to use it. So here's the QR code and the link to the database. Please use it and let us know what you think. Back over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. And we'll put that QR code on our website, on the website for the event after the event is over, so you can get it there if you haven't gotten it in the chat or from Mario's presentation. So let me turn first to Sanjeev. You're a renowned expert, Sanjeev, on matters of domestic revenue mobilization and tax affairs. What, from your vantage point as a long-time analyst of these issues, how do you see the new IMF revenue database? What's the advantage of it?
Thank you, Mark. Let me first start by thanking Mario for his very clear presentation. He summarized the key elements of the new database. As someone, as Mark said, I've worked on revenue issues in low-income and emerging markets for several years. And I can really attest that having a simple, comprehensive database is a major advancement because it allows us to have a consistent and accurate understanding of revenue dynamics across countries and regions. In the previous work that I did at the IMF and recently at CGD, I often had to rely on multiple databases to validate empirical results. This new resource mitigates that fragmentation that we needed to be able to validate the results and provide some useful policy insights. As Mark said, the timing of this database couldn't be better. Mark also mentioned about the need for additional resources. The last year, a G20 report highlighted that 2/3 of the resources required for development must come from domestic sources, including domestic resource mobilization. And of course, the remainder would have to come from external sources. And similarly, an IMF study in 2019 estimated that low-income developing countries would need to raise domestic revenues by additional 5% of GDP to fund SDGs across 5 critical areas. Since then, the resource requirements have only grown due to COVID-19 and the urgent need for climate-related investments. Now, Mario's slides showed that it is possible to raise revenues in both low-income and emerging markets. These countries did increase tax collection by an average of 2 to 4 percentage points of GDP between 1990 and 2010. What this demonstrates is that targeted reforms combined with political commitment can indeed boost domestic revenues. But as Mario's pictures showed, between 2012 and 2020, domestic revenues have stagnated in both low-income and emerging market countries. And there are several countries that fall short of the 15% of GDP threshold needed to sustain development. Mario's presentation indicated that there remains potential to raise tax revenue of 5 to 8% in these economies, clearly reinforcing the view that well-informed, data-driven policy decisions could significantly impact development outcomes. Of course, there are challenges in implementing reforms. Nobody is minimizing those, but if we want to be able to generate resources for the SDGs and climate transition, we will have to deal with those challenges. I also expect the dataset to guide donor countries and international organizations in better aligning their financial and capacity building support. For example, if VAT or direct revenues are lagging in a particular country while growing in others, external partners could collaborate with the country to address weaknesses in tax design and implementation. Finally, having a consistent data set across time allows policymakers to observe long-term trends like Mario's slide showed, and really assess the impact of reforms on or external shocks on revenues. So in sum, this database represents an important step forward, and I commend Mario and his colleagues for this achievement. This resource will undoubtedly become essential in guiding effective, evidence-based fiscal policies that support sustainable development. But before I leave, I just would leave a question for Mario to respond to when he comes back later. He showed very interesting fact that there is a increase in take from the non-tax revenue, in particular from resource revenues. Why is this policy shift? Is it something which countries are doing? Is it because they are not able to they use the normal tax instruments? What is driving this outcome? Because it's important for going forward. And I think we like to learn from Mario's experience as to what is driving this shift. Thank you, Mark, for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Sanjeev. And I think you give a good you give us a good idea of the scope of these data and the many things they can be used for. Let me turn now to the Finance Secretary. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us. It's late in the day in Pakistan, I know, and we appreciate you being here. As Finance Secretary, you're often faced with the question of how much the economy can generate in revenue to fund the budget. Can you tell us how this database can help you inform this question, either directly or indirectly, through example for comparative analysis with other countries? How might you use these data?
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I think it's very, as Sanjeev was saying, it's a very useful, data source, very effective and very meaningful, and one which could actually lead countries like Pakistan to draw meaningful comparative analysis of where does it stand when it comes to tax to GDP ratios, where does it stand when it comes to revenue buoyancy, where does it stand when it comes to composition of revenue sources compared to peer economies or countries with similar economic structure. And that comparative analysis can in turn identify gaps, strengths, and weaknesses in our revenue system and can give us evidence-based insight for policy formulation. Another area, I think, where we can, the question often comes up in terms of potential that we have depending upon the macroeconomic assumptions that we forecast, internally in the Ministry of Finance, along with the central bank, and also going by, since we are in an IMF program, so we also take into account the macroeconomic assumptions of IMF, as projected for Pakistan for a given year. So I think, these forecasts, the predictability of these forecasts, the strength of these forecasts, and their relationship with the potential that, we can, potential or tax revenue that we can generate in a given year is very, very crucial. As when we compare Pakistan with countries having similar income levels and similar economic structure, our tax to GDP ratio is very low. And I think the distinctive feature of World dataset in identifying the sectoral contribution to tax to GDP is very critical, considering the political economy that we have. Of the three sectors, is, services, agriculture, and industry, their contribution to GDP vis-a-vis their contribution to tax contribution is quite disproportionate in Pakistan. For instance, agriculture has a GDP contribution of 19 to 20%. But its contribution to tax is less than 1%. For industry, whose contribution to GDP is, say, again roughly 20%, but its contribution to tax is more close to 70, ranges between 70 to 75%. So I think the data set actually can give us an insight into comparing ourselves with countries having similar economic structure, similar income levels, and where does their sectoral contribution stand vis-a-vis tax collections. So I think it's very, very instructive, very educative, and very informative. And it's also very important considering that we have set ourselves target of increasing tax to GDP from our current level, which is, close to 10%, which is very, very low, considering even when we compare it with the, low income countries, to take it to 13.7% by 2027. So I think, the whole range of statistics and the data set, which the World data set offers, especially in relation to comparative and peer economies, is going to be very useful for us as policy practitioners. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. That notion of benchmarking is critical for many policymakers across the world. And again, this database will allow that benchmarking to take place. Frankie, let me turn to you. In your role at the ATAF, you have a unique perspective on how regional tax collaboration can advance tax policy and tax administration ideas. Can you give us a few examples that are particularly important in your line of work where the World database can help you?
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone, or afternoon. To your question, I want to highlight mostly on ATAF. The role that I'm playing, it is knowing that ATAF first work toward enhancing tax policy and administrations across Africa. So me as a regional manager, I'm doing what we call to provide a strategy at the beginning on how we can implement this kind of collaborations among regions. Two examples that I can really highlight when I look at the World Leading Development Database, for me, I think it can contribute based on the on capacity enhancement and knowledge sharing already. Because when we look, when it comes to the data on the continent, we believe that such collaboration will be very important, first among institutions, and also on what we are providing, so that the good practice can be really well shared, experience also that we are learning, lessons that we are getting from such database can really facilitate most of these capacity buildings that we are bringing together. For example, a program that can gather officials that ATAFOL is organized across Africa, where we discuss tax revenue and non-tax revenue and how we can report on this. So for me, where I'm sitting, I say ATAF data already that we have been providing, and we only have just few indicators. So based on that experience, the indicators that we are facilitating to collect data on, they also allow comparability. And when I look at what you guys have worked out, for me, it's really recommendable because the time frame, first of all, it is very huge. 32 data point. It is very important for the period that we look at. And it gives already that historical information that one will need. So where I'm sitting, for me, I think it will help mostly policymakers, economists, tax administrators themselves, even all the researchers who can really be able to share that knowledge and also to have the comparability aspect of it when it comes to the revenue structures. We know. So if we can be able to compare, for me, it's a really very good things. But that I will highlight also on top of the revenue sharing and comparability, when we look at, let's say, the data, I also understand that there is something that I will see a role that can be, that we all can play. One of the important role, it is on capacity building initiative, because as we observe such, it's really given show us some of the volatility that we see in the data as have been reported over times. Sometimes you might see some of those discrepancy. So for me, those type of spikes that come out, it's already an opportunity for us to see how we can resolve them, how we can look at them and see how can this be addressed. So collaboration for me, it's a key. And if, let's say, I look now at how can we improve and so that it can be beneficial, especially when I think Mario was presenting, I pick up some of the key important aspects on the data. When I consider and I say, no, there is need also for harmonization. Harmonization, why I say that, because I've worked on the data across for African already showed to me that there are something that need to be harmonized. It's a crucial point also to do, because they are, why I'm talking about also harmonization, I say that harmonization is crucial to improving tax policy across Africa borders, even to go beyond Africa. So the diverse guideline that I observe, it already creates some of the barriers, and it's also lead to so much complexity to operate the data sometimes. So I believe one of the key take here for me as a tough employee, it's just to, let's say, I can commend and also as a tough to foster such dialogue between entities who are working mostly on data collected across the globe, so that we have a certain common framework that we can adhere to and see how we can do that. Yeah, I think that the aspect that I would like to highlight. Maybe on the second part, if I want, if you may allow, I can just maybe do it with some of the illustration, the role of this commendable database. For me, I can say that it will play, is already playing a pivotal role if it can facilitate that harmonization based on these two examples that I can maybe illustrate. In my view, let's take first the social contribution. In my analysis that I always do on this side, I always not included social contribution into the tax to GDP, while elsewhere it is an important part of that measure of the tax revenue performance. So already this, for me, I think it's something that really needed to look into it. And another that I can mention also, it's the element of tax on international trade, such as the import duty for some of the group, let's say, the regional economic community on the continent. I just take the case of the SACU, the Southern African Customs Union sub-region. In that group, according to them, they report countries. These countries report the receipt received from the SACU as grant. But well, on the other side, you see that it is considered, it should be considered as tax revenue and such. So these things for me already, it's really highlight and say this is a really good opportunity where we can really address such and be able to have really a well-harmonized data that across the globe can be comparable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frankie. I think you make the case for harmonization very clearly. And certainly I've been in situations where rather than arguing about substance, you argue about what the data are. And you can avoid, in fact, that initial argument and get right to the substance. And it's particularly important, too, in capacity development to set objectives for capacity development. And this data set gives you the potential to set reasonable objectives given on world experience. So let me turn now to Nara. Nara, as an academic researcher, can you give us a few examples of how the World Database can be used to advance the teaching of public finance and taxation at your university and in your research as well?
Thank you very much, Mark. And first, I would like to really thank Mario for inviting us to attend this event and participate in this event. And also congratulations to you, Mario, and your team for this very seminal initiative. So we know that, I mean, in the context of academia, obviously having a single extensive revenue data spanning over almost 3 decades is crucial for research and evidence-based decision making. And as we saw a little bit in your presentation, Mario, taxation remains very important, at least in the African context for Africa's development. For example, especially in the post-COVID-19 recovery, where African economies face really rising fiscal deficits, averaging approximately 5.4% of GDP in 2022. And in this case, tax reform can really help reduce dependency on aid, on debt. And also in the face of the Russian-Ukraine war, which has completely disrupted commodity supplies and worsened inflation, is also very important to see how enhanced revenue mobilization can actually help offset fiscal pressures and stabilize public services. So we see a lot of insight from this database that can be offered, at least for research in the African context. Insight related to, for example, the revenue composition, as was said earlier, and the growth potential. And then also insight related to climate actions through taxation. We know that many African countries, they lack environmental taxation, despite the potential for addressing externalities. So this database can actually help track the progress of green taxes across Africa, enabling evidence-based strategy for climate mitigation. And it can also be useful in tracking what's happening in the informal economies, because, as you know, informality accounts for over 50% of GDP in sub-Saharan Africa. So this database can help analyze how indirect taxation like VAT can actually capture revenue from informal sector, such as what we've seen, for example, in Rwanda, VAT expansion reform. And the insight that can emanate from this database can actually be linked to the SDGs, especially the SDG 16, related to strengthening institutions. In this case, strengthening transparent tax systems, and also SDG 17, which is basically strengthening the tax system for domestic resource mobilization. And of course, it can be really important for the Agenda 2063. Which is basically Africa financing its own development, mainly from own sources of revenue. So how can it be useful for academic teaching, also research? So in our context, for example, we have the Public Policy Hub here at the University of Pretoria, where we emphasize evidence-based research to support decision-making in the public sector. So central to our mission is to actually co-produce reform relevant and evidence-based research in partnership with the public sector to support data-driven decision-making. So this involves then really relying on data accessibility and equipping, of course, both scholars and policymakers with the tools that they need to address Africa developmental challenges. So therefore, this database is with this extensive revenue spanning 3 decades, as I mentioned earlier, represent really a transformative resource that really aligns with our missions at the Public Policy Hub, at least in the area of taxation. So it can really help enrich the curriculum with real-world case studies, first of all. So we can bring interactive case studies analysis in our teaching with the students. We can, for example, expose students to the use of the database to analyze real-world policy impact, for example, comparing how VAT reforms affected revenue mobilization in Uganda versus Zambia, which basically would then foster a critical thinking and practical application. We can, for example, design a assignment where the students will be involved in replicating studies like the tax potential that Mario just presented, teaching therefore students to the mechanic of empirical fiscal analysis. It can also be very important for comparative policy analysis, obviously, where we can create student projects comparing tax structures, for example, direct versus indirect taxes across resource-rich versus resource-scarce countries. It can also help simulate policy scenarios, creating those mini policy labs with the students where we can use, again, this world database to simulate fiscal policy challenges. For example, how can Nigeria close its tax gap by increasing VAT compliance, for example, and what policies can Tanzania boost Tanzania implement to boost property tax revenue to match, for example, the South Africa level. So we can also use the database to create dynamic simulations, right? Allowing students to actually model how, for example, tax rate changes will influence compliance and revenue across different income groups or different type of countries, as presented in the database. So it's very also rich for research opportunities. Obviously, we can conduct tax benefit analysis where researchers can actually investigate how different revenue composition can impact inequality and poverty in Africa, for example. And we can assess, for example, the resource dependence versus revenue stability by allowing students to assess how resource dependence can affect long-term revenue stabilities, for example, comparing the success stories in Botswana versus what some of what we're not seeing yet, at least in Angola and in Nigeria, in terms of dependence in resource taxation. And it can also help with the collaboration with the government, right? So we collaborate, for example, we can collaborate with the South Africa Treasury, which we're actually doing right now, to evaluate the impact of property tax using this database as a baseline. So definitely in terms of teaching, it can really be helpful in terms of bringing more real life case studies to our teaching, therefore really strengthening our curriculum, but also research for evidence-based policymaking. Thank you.
Thank you, Nara. I think you illustrate well both the multiplicity of challenges that require insight into taxes and the many, many ways that these data can be used. I think they'll be helpful to people around the world in their analyses. Mario, let me turn back over to you. Sanjeev raised one question. You might want to react to the other speakers, but we've gotten quite a few questions from our audience. Let me add one in here at this point. Someone asked, is your database more robust than other similar databases? Have you done any comparisons with similar databases that are out there? And you can talk to any of the other issues that the panelists raised.
Thanks, Mark. Let me start by your question. Yes, we have. I think in terms of coverage, country coverage, it is the largest. There is no comparable, I think, out there. So the databases that come close are the OECD Revenue Statistics Database, which is now a compilation of what the OECD used to do, just OECD countries, back then something like 25, I believe, which now grew to include regional databases from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia. So that compilation is essentially focused on tax revenues, not total revenues. It also has some differences in definitions. So the OECD Revenue Statistics, for example, classifies Social Security contribution as taxes. The GFS manual does not. These are non-tax revenues in the sense that by contributing to Social Security, taxpayers can expect some benefit, direct benefit in the future, while we know that taxes in principle have no expectations of direct benefits. So the GFS manual has a slightly different classification of certain items, and also it's more comprehensive. It's about all government transactions, not only taxes. The other databases are regional. Of course, we know very well Eurostat covers European countries. A few of the other regional databases are actually incorporated in the OECD database, the CIAD database in Latin America, and the Africa database that covers slightly, I think, more than 50% of African countries. So I think there is complementarity, but also really what we focus on is this holistic perspective on government revenues, which we think is really important. We know, for example, that the interaction, maybe I can answer Sanjeev's question. There is, in the work that we did on tax potential, we estimated that in emerging market and low-income economies, roughly an increase of 1 point of GDP or $1, let's say, one monetary unit in natural resource revenues is correlated with a decline in tax revenues in the same proportion. So on average, countries in emerging economies and low-income countries tend to reduce their taxation by an amount equivalent of what they derive from natural resource rent. interestingly, in advanced economies, there is no such relationship. So in advanced economies, let's say discovery of oil in a high-income country, European countries today most likely will not lead to any substantial decline in taxation. Now, why countries do it is a bit more difficult to answer, and I think this is Sanjeev's questions. And here I want to go to one of the issues that the financial secretary raised, which I think is a great point, and that is how the composition of revenues can inform political economy decisions. If you relate today, for example, the composition of revenues to the composition of GDP, and try to make sense of how countries over time levy revenues from a component of value added rather than another, then you'll see clearly in developing countries and emerging economies that buoyancy of some of the components is less than one, meaning that revenues in time do not keep up with the growth in value added of certain components of GDP. And this, I think, can inform the political economy issues that the financial secretary raised. Is it politically more difficult to raise revenues from a VAT or from a personal income tax? So I think these questions are interesting from an analytical perspective and can inform why or how certain countries were able to address issues of political economy to raise income taxes, for example, while others did not. To Nara's points, I think a lot of great points. I think for me, the most important thing really is to, particularly in regions like Africa, Middle East, Central Asia, is to make taxation more prevalent in public finance studies in universities. And today, the new generations of PhD are data hungry and they are very, very good at using data. Technology, software today gives us the chance to manipulate data in ways that we did not have only 10 years ago. And my hope is that the use of data to inform policymaking in a number of areas, and Nara mentioned many of those, will increase. And if this increases, then the interest in transparency and explaining why certain taxes work and others don't, I hope that this will also increase. Finally, Frankie, you mentioned so many things. I don't know where to start and where to stop, but let me just pick up on maybe two things. One is what you mentioned is the importance of taxes on international trade and what they mean, how they are actually classified. In the GFS, there's a clear definition of what a tax on international trade is, which is it's a discriminatory tax. It's a tax that applies on imports of goods that does not apply on production of the same goods domestically. And we tried very, very hard to make sure that we don't mix in those revenues anything else, things like excises or VAT. But the point that you make is that in Africa, for example, taxes on international trade are still about 20 to 25% of tax revenues. So they are not negligible, right? They declined a bit over time, but they're not negligible. And this is important. So that's understanding how these taxes are levied. Now, in the database, we report the total, but trade tariffs are probably one of the most complicated policy instruments used by governments. So it's important to understand how they are raised and their potential in the future, or the interaction with domestic taxation. The main one is how, for example, VATs in the 90s and early 2000s replaced tariff revenues in a very, very large number of countries. And the other issue that I would mention that Frankie mentioned, obviously very important for the IMF too, is the use of the database in capacity building, which is extremely important. When you go to a country and you do a table or a graph of comparisons, either of data directly or estimates like tax potential, or perhaps some proxies of whether the tax system is regressive or progressive. Policymakers always want to know what the neighbors, close or far away, are doing. How do I look vis-a-vis the others? So in capacity building, this benchmarking is extremely important. And, wrong or right sometimes tend to be convincing, more rapidly convincing than other more complicated studies of taxation. So let me stop here for the second round, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks, Mario. I encourage our audience to send in questions. We've already gotten quite a few. I have a set of questions for our panelists, but we'll take your audience questions later. Nara, let me turn to you. Following up on what Mario just said, how important is comparative analysis in government revenue level and structures? Oftentimes governments say, well, look, I'm unique. I don't really care what's going on other places. To what extent can comparative analysis help in these discussions?
Thank you very much, Mark. Actually, before I answer the question, I just wanted to just raise the point of Maria. I think you mentioned the tax gap of 8.8% earlier, which basically signal a strong revenue potential that can be really unlocked through a combination of boosting administrative capacity and leveraging modern technology. And I think this is also where research and AI and machine learning can actually really help, especially with this massive database that you really have to really, get into that to help basically on earth that potential for Africa's sake. So just to then address your questions about why comparative analysis actually matters here. So we as mentioned earlier, I think was Mario or somebody else. So the comparative analysis is crucial for identifying best practices and understanding the structural differences, and of course fostering also innovation. It will enable policymakers to benchmark their fiscal performance, identify the gaps, but also learn from the peers, as was said earlier. So they can use comparison, for example, to evaluate the revenue potential relative to the peers with similar economy, and also use that for policy impact on equity, on poverty, on growth, and also they can use that to the comparative analysis to help evaluate administrative efficiency and compliance level. So just a few examples. Let's take Uganda versus Kenya in terms of the VAT reforms. So we saw that Kenya drastically increased the VAT compliance by automating the tax collections and simplifying these exemptions, therefore boosting revenue by almost 2% of GDP within 5 years. Uganda, on the other hand, they initially struggled due to complex rules and weak enforcements, but later on they finally adopted similar automation reforms as Kenya, and therefore also improving VAT efficiency later on. So taking the example of Nigeria versus Ghana in terms of resource revenue management, for example, we know that both countries are resource rich, and Ghana's Petroleum Revenue Management Act of, I think, 2011, ensured that the oil revenue were allocated transparently to a stabilization fund and public investment to mitigate actually the oil price volatility. But Nigeria faced challenges in managing their oil windfalls, leading, of course, to fiscal volatility. But later on, we saw that Angola and Nigeria, they try to now adopt similar strategies informed by the Ghana success, for example. And that's where, again, the comparative analysis really matters, so that the countries do not have to reinvent the wheel, but actually learn from their peers, not to copy and paste, because that's a big no-no, as we've seen in so many countries with importing policies from the West, but then basically contextualizing what we learn from their peers, within the actual context of your own country. So we also see, for example, the comparison between the Nordic versus African context in terms of the equity in taxation, where, for example, Mauritius adopted the progressive taxation models from some Nordic countries to emphasize really taxation of wealth and capital to reduce inequality. Similar reforms can actually be applied in middle-income African countries, which has already been done, for example, in South Africa. And in East Africa, the East African communities, we also see, for example, comparative tax analysis among the EAC members, Rwanda, Kenya, and Tanzania, that reveal the importance of actually harmonizing tax policies for cross-border trade. For example, Rwanda's excise tax alignment with regional standards, actually, we saw a boost after that alignment in its custom revenue, for example. So those are a few examples where that comparative analysis can actually be, based on that kind of data set, can actually be important for decision making, where again the policymakers can learn from others without repeating the same mistakes, but again while contextualizing the success stories of other countries within their own specific context. Thank you.
Thank you, Nara. I think I'm going to pick one phrase out of what you said. It's not copy and paste, but it's learning and understanding the context that other countries have been in and adapting it to your own context. Frankie, let me turn to you. Based on your reading of the World Database, how do you see it changing your work at ATEF, say in the next year? What are you going to do differently?
Maybe I will say, what are we going to do differently? So for me, as I've said already, maybe the role that also we all can play. On my side, I think I see the role of facilitating first the harmonization that I've mentioned. It's something that has been at the heart for quite some time of ATAF, but really we have not yet engaged in that. So for me, I believe such engagement, I can really be a champion for the platforms or a dialogue. That way we can bring those who are working around such database to just see and trying to start looking really deeply. How can we do this? For me, and like the world as presented today, I said, and yourself, you have mentioned, it covers many countries, more than 190 countries, and for a very long period, and it has so many, the composition of the tax revenue and even non-tax revenue, the way it's structured for me, I think it's quite appealing and trying to cut across, can be used also as a source for such initiative. Because why? And, I think we always say, let's not duplicate some of these things. The wheel have already been created long ago. Why not use what is there? Why not start entering some synergies so that some of the things that we can end, so we have almost the same definition, because the
recording stopped.
It is also the comparability, even Nara have said about that. So, because if we can be able to compare easily instead of not be able to compare, sometimes when you look, let's say, in the region where I'm focusing on Africa, it's important for me, let's say, when I look at the database in the region of Africa, and when I look at what you guys are presenting, because sometimes we compare because it is in the same region. Why not use some other characteristics, such as the natural resource-rich countries? When I look at that and say, no, maybe when it comes to, I'm looking, let's say, at this type of tax head, instead of just do it the same way where I have to compare to my neighbor country, or I have to compare to another country who's in my region, but I can still compare with others who are in the same characteristic, where we present this type of characteristics. As I have said, when I look at the resource-rich countries, then on some specificity, I can be able to compare with others. And I've seen it. The world is providing that it's cover across all this, and that means it's something that can be useful there. And another maybe role that things that can change the way I'm doing my work as well. I think it will be also to listen in the recommendations that we can give out there. You know, it's this world, it gives us at least a large idea of some of the recommendations or reforms. You know, we can get inspired because we have now a very large set of comparison, a large set of data set that we can refer and do very well-informed reforms when informed function of legislations, and even in when we have to offer some of this assistance, technical assistance, it gives us at least some idea where we can really be able to refer and really provide well some of this recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Frankie. So, Mr. Secretary, we've heard from Frankie how this data set may change his work. How might it change your work? Could you see using this to set benchmarks and motivate the internal discussion for your domestic revenue mobilization agenda within Pakistan?
Yes, thank you very much. I think the point, I would go back to point that Nara was making, and I think having this comparative analysis, comparative data sets showing how different countries are performing when it comes to tax is a great point. And I think this is the best thing that you as a policy practitioner you get out of this data set. She was citing the example of, say, Nigeria and Ghana. So I think as a finance secretary, I can use the cross-country data, making that a basis for setting realistic and aspirational benchmarks for Pakistan's domestic revenue mobilization agenda. And I think those benchmarks could, center around tax to GDP ratio, revenue diversification index, or sectoral tax contribution, the point that I was making in response to your first question. And operationalizing these benchmarks would, of course, would mean, embedding them within a broader reform agenda, which includes, institutional strengthening, leveraging technology for tax administration, and fostering public trust in the tax system. I think the great point about, and as the other speakers have, already hinted that and mentioned that and highlighted that, is, benchmarks which show that, some countries have done well. And then, we can, looking at those countries, we can adopt those reforms, For instance, say when it comes to tax to GDP benchmarks, the countries like Vietnam and Philippines have successfully increased their tax to GDP ratios through targeted reforms. So that could be, a learning lesson for a country like Pakistan. Or, broadening the tax base, when it comes to like countries like New Zealand and South Africa, who have reduced exemptions and zero-rated items in their VAT systems, or countries like UK, which are using data analytics to identify discrepancies and patterns of evasion in VAT filings. So I think it's a great resource to actually compare yourself where you are, compared to countries having similar income levels and even advanced economies, how they have done well and how they have pushed their tax to GDP ratios. What have they done? What reforms they have initiated? What actions they have taken? Whether it comes to, reducing the tax expenditures, whether it comes to leveraging technology, whether it comes to, bringing reforms in the tax administration itself, So, as they call people, process technology. So on all those areas you could focus on, learning from these benchmarks in the first place and getting to know where some countries have done remarkably well, and then taking lessons from those countries to actually have policy prescriptions for yourself, and to get that implemented. So I think it's as I said earlier, it's a great tool to have in the first place. When it comes to tax collection, we talk about strengthening compliance mechanisms, or we talk about coordination across different jurisdictions. I think in a federal structure like Pakistan, that coordination it becomes very, very critical. It's not just a question of political economy. It's also a question of having a particular Fed structure, where states or provinces, as we call them in Pakistan, how do they, interact, or how does the intergovernmental fiscal relationship figure in when it comes to tax system? What are the areas where they tax, or where they have the constitutional jurisdiction, and what are the areas where federal government has a constitutional jurisdiction? And again, you can go back to our data set and see the countries having similar federal structure, and how they have done in their tax to GDP ratios. So I think all these this information could become the starting point for you as a policymaker to start reforming your tax administration system. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Sanjeev, let me turn to you. How could the database be used to assess the motivation for tax reform, say in a resource-rich country where taxes flow easily, or in a country that relies significantly on grants for its spending program?
Thank you, Mark. I'll build on the response that Mario gave, because he tried to explain to me that there is a displacement that happens when countries collect more revenues from natural sources. They collect less from other taxation sources. So this, to me, is not a good sign, because you're looking for a well-diversified domestic tax base, rather than relying more and more on resource taxation. And why? Because we know the natural sources are finite and will eventually be depleted. And they cannot assume these resources to be a sustainable source of long-term finance. And we are trying to finance SDGs and trying to finance climate transition. So there is this issue of sustainability of resources of the tax base. And then we also know from our experience that resource revenues are inherently volatile, which can lead to quite a bit of budget instability. And I think this is something which people like Nara, people like me would have to study now. If the share of resource revenues is increasing in these countries, has it increased their budget volatility? What kind of budget rules do these countries need to be able to mitigate this volatility? And then, there's the other big issue of governance. There is a lot of literature and discussion which says that heavy dependence on resource revenues can lead to reduced public scrutiny of government operations. So this will have the impact of reducing trust in public services and governance. So, this is, again, to me, a worrying trend. If this is where countries are going, that they are relying more and more on natural resources to fund their operations. And so what does it mean for different aspects of governance? And that, and I I know the results of your study. I've done a couple of them myself, which I got similar kind of results, where there is the displacement of non-resource domestic taxes when natural resources are increased. But I think this, going back to the database, this database can support resource-rich countries in designing their tax systems to favor growth-friendly options, because some taxes are more friendly to growth than others, because ultimately you don't want to tax the economy that it stops growing. You want to, so there is a hierarchy of taxes which are conducive to growth, and the literature sort of says that VAT is more friendly to growth. So, and some of the studies that I did, I found that natural resource rich countries, they were displacing VAT taxes, which meant they were following a tax structure which was not conducive to growth. So I think that one could use this tax base to be able to deal with these issues. So a similar kind of relationship, Mark talked about aid, and we started the discussion from the resource needs, and for many low-income countries, resources are coming by way of grants or loans, and they would need those resources going forward, for sure. But we also know there is a declining trend from donors' side as well. So a similar kind of relationship that I found exists between offshore development assistance and domestic revenue effort. So an increase in net ODA, especially grants, has been found to be associated with lower tax revenue. And of course, over the last couple of years, this relationship has, this association has weakened, reflecting efforts by countries to mobilize more tax revenues. We also found that the grants tend to have a negative impact or have a dampening effect on VAT. So VAT performance is affected when you have more of grant revenues. And again, as I said, VAT is more sort of conducive to growth, and so you are affecting those the growth prospects of the economy. So the issue of nexus between aid flows and domestic tax revenues remains important as international community seeks to challenge more resources to developing countries to meet the SDGs and address climate transition. And this new database will provide valuable tool to explore ODA revenue tax nexus. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Sanjeev. So we've got quite a few questions from the audience. Let me start. There's a great deal of interest in some of the analysis that Mario presented based on the database, particularly in this notion of fiscal gaps or potential revenue. The question is, how reliable are those? Can you do any more composition? What more, if you will, what more texture can you offer us on those estimates? Mario?
Thank you, Mark. So, yes, I mean, well, first, just a couple of words on the methodology. What we try to do here is to estimate what we call the tax frontier, which is, for a country, it is what is the best possible outcome of the tax system that you can get based on the experience of the best performer. This is your frontier, essentially. This is where the best performers. It doesn't mean that you have to go there, right? Because taxation involves social choices. It just tells you that if you want to go there, it is possible on the basis of what the best performers do. And then you can think about, you know, what you want to do on the basis of that gap. Now, these estimates are they are sensitive to the size of the sample that you choose, the composition of the sample, and to the economic and institutional variables that you actually put in the regressions. So, like any exercise in econometrics, when these change, any results are data specific. They are specific to the sample that you choose. When you change that sample, things could change. What we're hoping with this database is that this is no longer a sample. For the tax series, it's the whole globe, that the estimates that we provide do take into account, for example, variables like size of economies, which could affect the level and composition of revenues, particularly tax revenues, whether economies are rich in natural resources, whether grants are important, the composition of GDP, but the main variable really that drives to a large extent these estimates is GDP per capita, meaning that over time, it's very, very difficult to understand how growth affects taxation and taxation affects growth. But we do know that income levels are important. So as countries actually grow their income levels, their tax to GDP ratio grows, even if they don't do any policy changes. So at constant policies, the tax to GDP grow. And that's because some taxes are more buoyant than GDP. If you think of progressive taxation, for example, when you get rich, income levels, you know, rise, you're going to be in a different tax bracket. You may also change certain aspects to the tax bases affected by VAT, and you're more capable of actually capturing that tax because informality is reduced, for example, that you have better access to that tax base. So for a number of reasons, when income levels rise, tax to GDP ratios rise. So I would say, you know, the estimates the exercise I showed was precisely to see how sensitive the estimates were relative to the database we used last year. And the answer, not that much, because the tax series was very, very robust in our view. Now, if you go to the composition, that's probably a different story. There are researchers actually who try to do the same exercise for the personal income tax. You know, what is the potential of the personal income tax on the basis of the best performers in this area? So these are trickier technically. I don't want to go into too much details, but it's not something that we have done. The exercise was primarily focused on the total tax gap, excluding, and this is where really what we did perhaps is a bit different from other researchers, is the tax series that we take is really clean of things like revenues from natural resources or social security contributions. So we focused really on a narrow definition of taxation to estimate this gap. If I can say just a few things, perhaps this is common from all the reactions I received or the panelists mentioned, which is the importance of doing case studies. Now, in economics, we tend to go to averages. We like regressing to the average because it hides a lot of differences. It hides a lot of things that we can't explain. And I think, you know, one area that we find really interesting in capacity building at the IMF is to do country case studies where you actually take not only the outcomes of taxation or the revenue system overall, but also over time quantify or proxy the reforms taken by the government in the policy and administration areas, and try to actually put some figures on these reforms and see how correlations between the reforms and tax revenues or total revenues change. And I think the database does give this opportunity. We do this with tax rates at the IMF a lot because we have long series of tax rates. But we know from experience that actually most important reforms affecting revenues positively or negatively are not necessarily tax rates, but really the tax base. Things like tax incentives, exemptions, deductions, tax holidays, different treatments of different taxpayers on the basis of size, different treatments of FDI for the corporate tax, for example. So these things are more difficult to quantify, but at least the database provides the outcomes of various tax revenues, which researchers could relate to policy input and see what they can learn from that. The last thing I wanted to mention is, which is important for some questions asked, or maybe to come, is we have a technical note for the database, which will be published on the landing page of the database, I hope in a couple of weeks. So that gives more details of how the data was constructed. And so I think some of the answers that people have on their mind may actually be in that note.
Great, thank you, Mario. Mr. Secretary, did you want to come in?
Just wanted to request you if I could leave. It's like been a long day since morning, so I thought
we're almost done. So if you need to go, please go. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sanjeev. Thank you, Mario. Thank you, Dara, and thank you, Atif. It's been a great pleasure interacting with you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
There's a lot of interest in linking these data to other data. People would like to see similar data on expenditures. I wonder if that's in the works. But also, how does it link to TDAT? How can you link it to other pieces of what the IMF publishes? Mari, if you want to say a few quick words on that, and then we'll wind up.
So I'd love to do that, but that's not my area. So the GFS, as I mentioned, is actually a database on government fiscal operations, whether these are current or capital. So it's a rich database. The difference of the IMF GFS data with what we did is that GFS is a voluntary database. So countries report what they want, when they want on their fiscal operations. And actually in the world database, we found that about 25 countries report to the GFS in a consistent manner and regularly. And we used a lot of these data, as we explained in the note, in the technical note that will be put out on the website. On the spending side, it's I think it's needed for the same reasons, perhaps even more than the revenue reasons, because the development community researchers are as interested, if not, I would say, a lot more interested in how governments spend, and relative to how government tax. There's a lot more interest in this. I don't have a good answer for this, Mark. I think I'm going to have to let others talk about this.
I was going to say, take that back to your bosses at the IMF and have other people put these.
I think that's the message, and I got the message.
Very useful. But I think, in fact, our audience can help by using this database, by interacting with it, and by letting the IMF know that it's a useful tool. And as soon as the world sees that this is being used, perhaps we can motivate a similar tool on expenditures. So we're basically out of time. Let me thank our panelists for their participation today. It's been a great discussion. Let me thank the audience for your patience, and I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of your questions. We simply ran out of time. I'm sure you can direct some of the questions, technical questions you have, to Mario at the IMF, but thank you for a very good discussion, and we look forward to seeing you again at another CGD event. Bye, all.
And thank you for linking us.